When she arrived for a holiday job interview, the woman saw a photo of her father in the Millionaire'S office. What she revealed left him in shock. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The icy chill of December seeped through Clara Dawson's well-worn coat as she stood outside the imposing iron gates of the St. Clair estate. She clutched a thin folder, her resume tucked neatly inside, and took a deep breath to steady herself. The stakes were high. This job could mean a chance to lighten the load on her family, at least for a little while. Her widowed mother worked tirelessly, and Clara's siblings relied on her for school supplies and holiday cheer that had been hard to come by in recent years. Pushing the intercom button, Clara announced her arrival. The gate creaked open, revealing a long, tree-lined driveway that led to a grand mansion bathed in golden light. Her steps quickened as she crossed the threshold into a world she never thought she'd find herself in. Clara sat on a velvet-upholstered chair in the cavernous front hall, trying to ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. The estate's holiday decor was already in place, twinkling lights wrapped around banisters, wreaths adorned with crimson ribbons, and a towering Christmas tree shimmering with gold ornaments. It was a world apart from the modest decorations back home. "Miss Dawson," a sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. A stern-looking butler gestured toward a set of double doors. "Mr. St. Clair will see you now." Gathering her courage, Clara stepped into a sprawling office. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the snow-dusted grounds outside, and the walls were lined with bookshelves that looked more for show than use. Behind a sleek mahogany desk sat Victor St. Clair, his piercing gaze making her feel like a subject under a microscope. Victor, a man in his early 40s, was immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and authority. He barely glanced up from the papers on his desk as he motioned for Clara to sit. "Your resume says you have experience in event planning," Victor said, his tone clipped. "Why apply for a position that's essentially seasonal housework?" Clara straightened in her chair, willing her voice to remain steady. "Because I believe the skills I've developed, managing tight budgets, coordinating schedules, and adapting under pressure, can bring value to this role. And I'm willing to work hard to prove that." Victor's lips curved into something resembling a smirk. "We'll see," he said. "My expectations are high, Miss Dawson. Mistakes aren't just frowned upon, they're unacceptable." As Clara prepared to respond, her eyes wandered to a photograph perched on a nearby side table. It was a striking image, her late father, Charles Dawson, shaking hands with a younger Victor St. Clair. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. "Is something wrong?" Victor asked, his sharp tone cutting through Clara's trance. Clara blinked, then pointed to the photo. "That's my father. Charles Dawson." Victor's expression shifted, the guarded confidence faltering for just a moment. He glanced at the photograph and then back at Clara. "Charles Dawson was your father?" His voice softened slightly, though his demeanor remained distant. "Yes," Clara said, her emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "He passed away a few years ago. But before that, before everything changed, he was a wonderful man. A brilliant engineer. And apparently, someone you knew well enough to keep his picture in your office." Victor leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Charles was more than an acquaintance. He was my mentor, one of the few people who believed in me when I was starting out. We worked together on some of my first projects." "Then why did our families lose touch?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "He always spoke highly of you, but as far as I know, you disappeared from our lives." Victor's mouth tightened into a thin line, and he stood abruptly, turning to face the window. "It's complicated," he said after a long pause. "There were business decisions, things I had to prioritize. But that doesn't mean I stopped valuing what your father taught me." Clara swallowed hard, her chest heavy with questions she didn't have the courage to voice. She could sense there was more to the story, but Victor's closed-off demeanor left no room for further probing. "Miss Dawson," Victor said, turning back to face her, "the past is the past. But I respect your father's memory, and I see potential in you. The holiday season is critical for me, and I need someone reliable to assist with the Christmas gala and other preparations. The job is yours if you're interested." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She could still feel the weight of her family's financial struggles, the pressure to bring some semblance of joy to her siblings this holiday season. And yet, the tension of being under Victor's scrutiny felt almost unbearable. "I'll take it," she said finally, her voice firm. "But I want to make one thing clear. I'm not just here for the paycheck. I want answers about my father, and I won't stop until I get them." Victor raised an eyebrow, his lips quirking into a faint, almost amused smile. "Fair enough," he said. "But don't let your curiosity distract you from the work at hand. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend. Reynolds will show you out." As the butler led Clara back to the front door, she couldn't help but steal one last glance at the photograph. Her father's face looked so full of hope and purpose, a stark contrast to the struggles he faced later in life. She promised herself then and there that she would uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Stepping back into the cold December air, Clara felt a mix of determination and unease. She had landed the job, but it was clear that working for Victor St. Clair would be no ordinary challenge. Still, if it meant helping her family and finding the missing pieces of her father's story, she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The morning after Clara accepted the job at the St. Clair estate, she walked up the grand driveway once again, a mix of determination and trepidation in her step. The sky was overcast, and the brisk wind carried a promise of snow. She adjusted her scarf, reminding herself why she was doing this, for her family and for answers about her father. The grandeur of the mansion still made her stomach flip, but this time, she was resolved not to let it intimidate her. Victor St. Clair greeted her with the same sharp, businesslike demeanor she'd encountered during the interview. He wasted no time laying out her responsibilities. She was to help manage the annual Christmas gala, oversee the decorations, coordinate caterers, and handle any unexpected problems. His instructions came rapid fire, as though he assumed she was already an expert on his preferences. Clara scribbled notes furiously, not daring to interrupt. By the end of their meeting, her notebook was filled with a checklist so daunting it made her head spin. Victor snapped his fingers to get her attention as she lingered in thought. "This gala needs to be flawless. If you think you can't handle that, speak up now." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I can handle it," she said firmly. Victor gave her a curt nod and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the ornate hallway. The first few days were grueling. Clara quickly realized Victor's perfectionism bordered on obsession. Every suggestion she made was either dismissed or met with thinly veiled disdain. When she proposed incorporating more local artisans into the gala's decor, a nod to the town's vibrant crafting community, Victor shot her down. "This isn't a flea market," he said, barely looking up from his tablet. Tasks that seemed straightforward turned into Herculean efforts under Victor's scrutiny. Setting up the dining room for a catering trial became a lesson in futility as he nitpicked everything from the alignment of the silverware to the temperature of the mock dishes. "Do it again," he'd say, waving a hand as though her work was an affront to his vision. Clara bit her tongue, channeling her frustration into getting the job done. As exhausting as Victor's demands were, she reminded herself why she was there. Each paycheck would go toward her siblings' holiday gifts and helping her mother catch up on bills. And perhaps, amidst the whirlwind of tasks, she might uncover more about the connection between her father and Victor. Not all of her time at the estate was unpleasant. Occasionally, Clara caught glimpses of a different Victor, a man who wasn't all sharp edges and clipped words. One afternoon, as she rearranged ornaments on the Christmas tree, she overheard him talking to his wife, Eleanor, in the next room. "They're the same ornaments we used when I was a kid," Victor said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. "My mother used to insist on decorating the tree herself. We had this tradition where she'd tell us the story behind each ornament as she hung it." Eleanor laughed softly. "And let me guess, you've memorized all those stories by now." "Of course," Victor replied, a faint chuckle in his voice. Clara smiled to herself as she placed a sparkling star near the top of the tree. For a brief moment, Victor sounded like a man who cared deeply about the spirit of Christmas, even if he rarely showed it. But such moments were fleeting. More often than not, Victor reverted to his brusque, demanding self. When Clara suggested rearranging the seating chart to accommodate last-minute RSVPs, he dismissed her idea outright. "The seating arrangement is final. If someone's unhappy, they can deal with it," he said, walking past her as though the conversation was over. Despite the challenges, Clara refused to back down. She began arriving early and staying late, poring over Victor's old files whenever she had a spare moment. She searched for anything that might shed light on her father's relationship with Victor. Late one evening, she found herself in Victor's study, sorting through a stack of dusty ledgers. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the fire crackling in the hearth. Her fingers brushed against a folder tucked at the back of a drawer. Inside were contracts and letters bearing her father's name, along with Victor's. One letter, in particular, caught her eye. It was dated years ago and referenced a project that had been pivotal for Victor's career. As Clara skimmed the text, her heart sank. The terms of the agreement were heavily skewed in Victor's favor. While it wasn't outright unethical, it was clear her father had taken a significant risk to support Victor's endeavors. The realization left a bitter taste in Clara's mouth. Her father had believed in Victor, had invested his time and expertise into helping him succeed. Yet Victor's success seemed to have come at a cost her family might still be paying. Clara slid the folder back into the drawer just as Victor entered the study. His eyes narrowed at the sight of her standing near his desk. "Do you make a habit of snooping, Miss Dawson?" he asked, his voice cold. Clara met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "I was organizing the files, as you asked." "If that counts as snooping, then I suppose I'm guilty." Victor studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Just don't waste time on irrelevant documents. The gala is in less than 2 weeks, and there's still plenty of work to be done." As he left the room, Clara exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. Victor's words had been dismissive, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, an unease he couldn't quite mask. Clara couldn't tell if it was guilt or something else entirely. The days leading up to the gala passed in a blur of activity. Clara worked tirelessly, coordinating with vendors, overseeing deliveries, and ensuring every detail was perfect. Victor continued to hover, quick to criticize but slow to offer praise. One afternoon, as Clara arranged poinsettias along the grand staircase, Eleanor approached her. Unlike her husband, Eleanor exuded warmth and charm. She placed a hand on Clara's arm, stopping her mid-task. "You've been doing a wonderful job," Eleanor said with a smile. I know Victor isn't the easiest person to work for, but trust me, he recognizes your effort. He just has a terrible way of showing it. Clara managed a small smile. Thank you. That means a lot. Eleanor tilted her head, studying Clara for a moment. You remind me of someone, she said softly. Your father, I think. He was always so dedicated, so determined to see things through. The mention of her father sent a pang through Clara's chest. She nodded, unsure of how to respond. Eleanor gave her arm a reassuring squeeze before walking away, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Victor's study as Clara sorted through a stack of papers on his desk. The room was quiet except for the faint crackle of the fireplace, but Clara's mind was anything but at ease. The past few days had been a whirlwind of preparations for the gala, yet no matter how busy she kept herself, her thoughts kept drifting back to her father and the unanswered questions that gnawed at her. The drawer she had peeked into before called to her again. Victor had mentioned nothing about its contents, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that it held more clues about her father's connection to him. Steeling herself, she opened it again. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the folders, careful not to disturb the carefully arranged files. There, sandwiched between architectural blueprints and financial reports, was a letter bearing her father's name. Clara pulled it out and scanned the contents, her eyes widening as the details came into focus. The letter outlined a business agreement between Charles Dawson and Victor St. Clair, an early partnership meant to kickstart Victor's career. At first, it seemed harmless, but as Clara read further, the terms became unsettlingly clear. Her father had invested significant resources into Victor's projects, trusting that they would both benefit. Yet Victor's name alone was listed as the sole benefactor for future profits, leaving Charles with only a fraction of what he had contributed. As Clara sifted through more documents, a clearer picture emerged. Victor's financial success had come at a cost, her father's cost. It wasn't outright theft, but it was undeniably opportunistic. And worse, the timing of the partnership's collapse aligned suspiciously with the period when her family began struggling. Clara felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. How could Victor, someone her father had clearly trusted, exploit him like this? She clutched the papers tightly, her mind racing. Victor entered the room, his footsteps soft on the carpet. You're still here, he remarked, glancing at the clock. I thought you'd have gone home by now. Clara turned to face him, her jaw set. I found these, she said, holding up the documents. Care to explain? Victor's expression shifted, his usual confidence faltering. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the papers in her hands. What exactly are you accusing me of, Miss Dawson? He asked, his tone measured but wary. I'm accusing you of taking advantage of my father, Clara said, her voice trembling with anger. He trusted you, invested in you, and you let him shoulder the risk while you reaped the rewards. And when things went south, you walked away, leaving him with nothing. Do you have any idea what that did to my family? Victor's face hardened. That's not how it happened, he said firmly. Your father made his own decisions. He was aware of the risks, just as I was. But you came out on top, didn't you? Clara shot back. You got your success, your mansion, your perfect little life. And we were left to pick up the pieces. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't personal, Clara. It was business. Your father and I had different priorities, and we made choices based on what we thought was best at the time. I didn't set out to hurt him or your family. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. That doesn't make it right, she said, her voice cracking. You may not have meant to hurt us, but you did. And you never even looked back. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Clara held up a hand to stop him. I'm done, she said. I can't work for someone who treats people like disposable stepping stones. Without waiting for a reply, Clara grabbed her coat and stormed out of the study. Victor called after her, but she didn't stop. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back as she walked down the hallway, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and sadness. The snow had started falling by the time Clara reached the estate's gates. She paused for a moment, letting the cold air fill her lungs. Her hands were still shaking, and she clenched them into fists to steady herself. Quitting meant losing the income her family desperately needed, but staying would have felt like a betrayal, to her father, to herself. As she walked back to town, Clara replayed the confrontation in her mind. She wanted to feel satisfied, vindicated even, but all she felt was hollow. Back at the mansion, Victor stood alone in his study, staring at the documents Clara had left on his desk. His mind churned with memories he'd long buried, of late nights working with Charles Dawson, of the risks they'd taken together, of the choices he'd made to ensure his own success. Eleanor entered the room, her arms crossed. What's going on? She asked, noticing the troubled look on his face. Clara quit, Victor said flatly. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And why is that? Victor hesitated, then handed her the documents. As she read through them, her expression darkened. Victor, she said, her voice low. This is bad. It wasn't malicious, Victor said defensively. It was business. Eleanor fixed him with a pointed look. That excuse might work in the boardroom, but it doesn't hold up here. You took advantage of her father, whether you meant to or not. And now you've driven her away just when we need her the most. Victor's jaw tightened. I didn't drive her away. She made her choice. No, Eleanor said sharply. You made the choice years ago when you put your ambition above everything else. And now it's coming back to haunt you. Without Clara, this gala is going to fall apart. And frankly, you deserve that. Victor opened his mouth to argue, but Eleanor cut him off. Fix it, she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. Not because of the gala, but because it's the right thing to do. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were. Victor stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain, not about his business acumen or his ability to solve problems, but about the kind of person he'd become. As Eleanor left the room, Victor sank into his chair, his mind racing. The Christmas gala had always been his way of honoring the people who had shaped his life. Yet here he was, faced with the painful truth that he had failed to honor the man who had helped him most. Victor St. Clair sat at the edge of his leather armchair, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared into the dying embers of the fireplace. The normally pristine study felt suffocating, cluttered with papers and the weight of Clara Dawson's accusations. He could still hear her words, sharp and unwavering, cutting through his defense. He had told himself for years that his choices had been necessary, that business had to come first. Yet now, the consequences of those choices seemed glaringly personal. The next morning, Victor found himself standing outside the local community center, a place he had driven past countless times but never entered. The sign above the door was faded, the building modest but bustling with life. Children's laughter echoed from inside, mingling with the scent of baked goods wafting through the cold air. Victor hesitated, his polished shoes crunching on the salted pavement. He had spent his career commanding boardrooms, negotiating deals, and delegating tasks. Yet now, the idea of walking through these doors to ask for forgiveness felt impossibly daunting. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the building hit him immediately, along with the chaotic energy of a dozen children running around, their voices overlapping in excitement. Clara was at the far end of the room, her back turned as she helped a young boy untangle a string of Christmas lights. "Miss Dawson," Victor said, his voice cutting through the noise. Clara stiffened but didn't turn around. "You're a little far from your ivory tower, Mr. St. Clair." Victor ignored the jab and stepped closer. "I need to speak with you." Clara finally turned, her expression guarded. "I think you said enough last night." "I didn't say enough," Victor admitted, his tone quieter now. "I should have listened to you." "I should have," he stopped, searching for the right words. "I'm sorry, Clara. For everything. For what happened to your father, for how I treated you. You were right. I let my ambition blind me to the consequences, and I've been too proud to admit it until now." Clara crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "That's a nice speech, but it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change how my family struggled while you built your empire." Victor took a step closer, his voice soft but earnest. "You have every right to be angry. And I can't undo the past. But I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head. "You don't get to just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. If you're serious about making things right, you need to prove it. Words aren't enough, Victor." Victor nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. "What do you want me to do?" Clara tilted her head, considering him for a moment. Then a small, sly smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You can start by volunteering here. Tomorrow night, we're hosting a Christmas dinner for the kids and their families. We're short on help, and I doubt you've ever served punch or washed dishes in your life. It'll be a good place for you to start learning what it means to give back." Victor blinked, caught off guard by the request. "You want me to volunteer?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "If you're serious about changing, show me. Otherwise, this conversation is over." Victor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be here," he said, his voice steady. "Good," Clara replied, turning back to the string of lights. "And don't be late. These kids don't care who you are, they just want someone who shows up." Victor left the community center feeling uncharacteristically unsure of himself. He had expected Clara to be stubborn, but her challenge had been both surprising and humbling. As he drove back to the estate, he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly ready to step out of his comfort zone. Back at the community center, Clara watched him leave through the window, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't sure if Victor could change, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of possibility. Victor St. Clair arrived at the school's community hall the next evening, dressed in casual slacks and a sweater that looked far too pristine for the bustling atmosphere inside. The room buzzed with activity, children darted between tables, their laughter mingling with the chatter of parents and volunteers. A Christmas tree, adorned with mismatched ornaments made by tiny hands, stood proudly in the corner, its lights flickering warmly. Clara spotted Victor immediately. His expression was somewhere between discomfort and disbelief as he took in the scene. She approached him with a clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. "You're late," Clara said, arching a brow. Victor checked his watch. "I'm 2 minutes early." "You're late," she repeated firmly, handing him an apron decorated with snowflakes. "Put this on. You're on serving duty tonight." Victor took the apron with a grimace. "Isn't there something more suited to my skill set?" Clara smirked. "You'll be serving mashed potatoes, not closing a merger." "I'm sure you'll manage." Victor slipped on the apron, muttering something under his breath. Clara led him to the serving line, where a cheerful older woman handed him a ladle and gestured to a massive tray of mashed potatoes. "Just scoop and smile, sweetheart," the woman said. "The kids will eat it up, literally and figuratively." Victor nodded stiffly and took his position behind the table. The line of children and parents moved quickly, and Victor soon discovered that just scooping and smiling was harder than it looked. His first scoop slid off the plate, splattering onto the table. The child in front of him burst into giggles, pointing at the mess. "Well, at least someone's enjoying themselves," Victor muttered as he cleaned it up. By the time he served his 10th plate, his rhythm had improved slightly, though his confidence was still shaky. Clara passed by, her arms full of paper plates, and paused to observe him. "You're doing fine," she said, her tone laced with teasing. "Though you might want to loosen up. It's mashed potatoes, not gold bullion." Victor glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Thanks for the sage advice." Clara laughed and moved on, leaving Victor to face his next challenge, a child with very specific requests. "Can I have a smiley face on my potatoes?" the little girl asked, her big eyes full of hope. Victor blinked. "A smiley face?" The girl nodded eagerly. Awkwardly, Victor used the back of the ladle to attempt a smiley face in the mound of potatoes. It ended up looking more like a lopsided blob, but the girl clapped her hands in delight. "Perfect," she declared before skipping off. Victor exhaled, shaking his head. "This is harder than it looks." After the serving line wound down, Clara approached Victor again, clipboard in hand. "Time for your next task," she said, motioning toward a table covered in cookies and frosting. "We need more cookies decorated for dessert." Victor stared at the table, his confidence wavering. "I'm not exactly an artist." "You don't have to be," Clara said with a shrug. "Just have fun with it. The kids won't judge your technique." Reluctantly, Victor joined the table. He picked up a plain sugar cookie and a piping bag filled with green frosting. His first attempt at a Christmas tree design turned out more like a green blob, but the child next to him burst out laughing. "That's supposed to be a tree?" the boy asked, his tone incredulous. Victor smirked. "It's a very modern interpretation." The boy laughed harder. "You're terrible at this." Victor chuckled, setting the cookie down. "You're not wrong." Clara passed by again, glancing at his creations. "Wow," she said, pretending to shield her eyes. "Are you trying to scare people away from dessert?" Victor shook his head but couldn't help the laugh that escaped him. "I'd like to see you do better." Clara grabbed a piping bag and a cookie, deftly creating a simple but elegant snowflake design. She handed it to Victor with a grin. "Like that," she said. Victor sighed dramatically. "Show off." Victor's transformation at the community dinner didn't happen all at once. At first, it was small things, a quick smile here, a genuine laugh there, but each moment chipped away at the polished armor he had worn for so long. It started during his chaotic attempt to lead the sing-along. The kids' unfiltered giggles at his exaggerated ha 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 and his awkward rhythm turned his embarrassment into something unexpectedly fun. By the end of the song, he found himself grinning in a way he hadn't in years. His next task involved serving punch to an enthusiastic crowd of children who seemed magnetically drawn to chaos. One particularly boisterous boy knocked over the ladle, spilling a bright red waterfall of juice onto Victor's pristine shoes. The boy gasped, his face frozen in horror, but before he could bolt, Victor crouched down. "Well, I guess my shoes were thirsty," Victor said, feigning seriousness. The boy blinked, then burst into laughter, prompting Victor to chuckle along with him. A nearby volunteer handed Victor a mop, and as he cleaned up, Clara watched from across the room. She wasn't sure which surprised her more, the fact that Victor didn't snap at the kid or that he was laughing about it. Later in the evening, Victor found himself tasked with leading a sing-along for the children. This, he quickly realized, was far outside his comfort zone. Armed with a microphone and a laminated sheet of lyrics, he stood in front of the crowd, his expression betraying his unease. "All right, kids," Clara called out, her voice carrying across the room. "Mr. St. Clair is going to lead us in Jingle Bells." The children cheered, and Victor shot Clara a withering look. She gave him a thumbs up, her grin widening. Taking a deep breath, Victor began singing, his baritone voice stiff at first. The children joined in enthusiastically, their energy contagious. By the second verse, Victor found himself relaxing, even adding a bit of humor by exaggerating the ha-ha-ha in the chorus. The kids erupted into giggles, and by the end of the song, Victor was laughing along with them. When the sing-along ended, one of the children tugged on Victor's apron. "You're kind of funny," the boy said, looking up at him. Victor crouched down to meet the boy's eye level. "Kinda funny? I thought I was hilarious." The boy giggled. "Maybe a little hilarious." Victor ruffled the boy's hair, a small smile tugging at his lips. As the evening wore on, Victor moved from task to task, each one presenting its own comedic challenges. While helping hang additional decorations, he accidentally toppled a string of lights, which ended up tangled around him like a glowing lasso. The children erupted in cheers, calling him Christmas Cowboy, a nickname that seemed to stick for the rest of the night. When one of the younger kids got upset about a missing stocking, Victor took it upon himself to find a replacement. He improvised with a red scarf and a touch of imagination, explaining to the boy that Santa sometimes left special delivery stockings for the most deserving kids. The boy's tears dried instantly, replaced with a wide grin as he hugged the scarf tightly. By the time dinner was served, Victor was seated at a table surrounded by children, their chatter filling the air as they shared stories about their favorite Christmas traditions. Victor found himself genuinely listening, laughing at their antics, and even sharing a few stories of his own. He recounted how, as a child, his mother had once burned the Christmas turkey so badly that the fire department showed up. The kids were in stitches, and for a moment, Victor forgot about the world outside the community hall. Clara observed him quietly as she worked alongside other volunteers. She had expected Victor to survive the evening by gritting his teeth and enduring the chaos, but instead, he seemed to be thriving. He wasn't just tolerating the kids, he was enjoying them. And they, in turn, seemed drawn to his awkward charm. When the dinner plates were cleared and the kids began gathering around the Christmas tree for story time, Clara took a seat next to Victor. He looked relaxed, his shoulders no longer carrying their usual tension. "I have to admit," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "you're better with kids than I thought you'd be." Victor glanced at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "I wasn't sure I had it in me either," he confessed. "But I think I needed this. More than I realized." Clara nodded, studying him. "They like you," she said. "Even if your cookies are terrifying." Victor chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not exactly a skill I've had much practice with." He paused, then added, "But tonight, it's different. I don't think I've felt this grounded in years." Clara looked at him more closely. The usual sharpness in his expression had softened, replaced by something genuine. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't defined by his wealth or his power, but by his ability to laugh at himself and care for others. Still, she reminded herself to remain cautious. A single night wasn't enough to erase years of arrogance and selfishness, but it was a start. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope for Victor St. Clair to become the man her father had once believed in. As the evening wound down, the children began gathering their coats and handmade crafts, their laughter still echoing through the hall. Victor stood near the exit, shaking hands with parents and exchanging goodbyes with the kids who had dubbed him Christmas Cowboy. When the last family left, Clara walked over to him, her arms folded but her expression less guarded than usual. "You survived," she said, her tone light. "Barely," Victor replied, though his smile suggested otherwise. Clara nodded, her gaze steady. "I'm impressed, Victor. You didn't just show up, you actually tried. And the kids, they'll remember tonight." Victor met her eyes, his voice quieter now. "Thank you for giving me the chance. I know I didn't deserve it, but I'm glad you pushed me to be here." Clara hesitated, then gave him a small smile. "Maybe there's more to you than I thought." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Clara. That almost sounded like a compliment." "Don't get used to it," she teased, turning away to help the other volunteers clean up. As Victor began gathering stray napkins and stacking chairs, he found himself reflecting on the night. He had walked into the community hall as a man doing what he thought was necessary to fix a mistake. But somewhere along the way, it had become more than that. He didn't feel like a businessman ticking off a task, he felt like someone who had finally stepped outside of himself, rediscovering a part of life he had long ignored. The next morning, Victor found himself pacing outside the community center, the weight of his next conversation pressing heavily on him. Despite the progress he had made at the dinner, he knew it wasn't enough to undo the mistakes of the past. Clara deserved more than a one-night effort, she deserved a genuine commitment to change. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The center was quieter today, the hum of volunteers and light chatter replacing the cheerful chaos of the night before. Victor spotted Clara across the room, arranging supplies for another event. Her focus was intense, her movements precise, as if she were blocking out the world around her. "Clara," Victor said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. She looked up, her expression neutral. "Victor. What brings you here?" "I wanted to talk," he said, stepping closer. "Properly this time." Clara crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the table. "All right, I'm listening." Victor hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "Last night, I realized something. For years, I've been so focused on achieving success that I stopped valuing the people who made it possible. I stopped looking beyond my own goals and seeing how my actions affected others, your father, your family, even you." Clara didn't respond immediately, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Victor pressed on. "You were right to call me out. I can't change what happened, but I can take responsibility for it. And I can promise you that going forward, I'll be different. I'll do better." There was a long pause before Clara finally spoke. "That's a nice speech, Victor, but words alone don't fix anything. What happens the next time something doesn't go your way? Do you go back to being the same impossible to work for boss who nitpicks everything and dismisses people's ideas?" Victor winced but nodded. "I don't have a perfect answer for that. But I do know this, I can't fix what's broken if I don't start somewhere. I want you to come back, not just because I need your help with the gala, but because I respect you. Your ideas, your determination, your ability to handle challenges, they're all things I need to learn from." Clara tilted her head, her expression softening slightly. "And if I come back, what's going to change?" Victor smiled faintly. "For starters, I'll try listening more and criticizing less. And if I slip up, Eleanor will definitely make sure I hear about it." That earned a small laugh from Clara. "She does have a way of keeping you in line." "She's had years of practice," Victor admitted. "So, what do you say? Will you give me another chance to prove I'm not a complete lost cause?" Clara sighed, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "All right, Victor. I'll come back. But only because I believe you're serious about changing, and because Eleanor scares me just a little." Victor laughed, extending a hand. Clara shook it firmly, a sense of cautious optimism passing between them. Back at the St. Clair estate, preparations for the gala resumed in full swing. Clara dove back into the work, her presence bringing a newfound sense of order and creativity to the chaos. True to his word, Victor made an effort to give her space to lead and implement her ideas. But old habits die hard. One afternoon, as Clara and a team of decorators worked on the grand ballroom, Victor walked in and immediately began rearranging the placement of centerpieces without consulting anyone. "Victor," Eleanor's voice rang out from the doorway, sharp and unmistakable. He froze mid-reach, turning to see his wife's stern glare. "Yes, dear?" "What are you doing?" she asked, her arms crossed. "I thought the flowers looked better in a triangular formation," Victor explained weakly. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And I suppose you asked Clara before making that decision?" Victor hesitated, then sighed. "No. Put the flowers down, dear," Eleanor said sweetly but firmly. Victor complied, backing away from the table with a sheepish grin. Clara, who had been watching the exchange with amusement, gave him a knowing look. "Old habits," Victor said, holding up his hands in surrender. "Let me handle this," Clara replied with a smirk. Despite occasional hiccups, the gala plans came together beautifully. Clara's ideas brought a fresh charm to the event, a mix of elegance and warmth that felt both sophisticated and inviting. She incorporated handmade touches, like local artisan ornaments on the Christmas tree and a dessert table featuring recipes submitted by the staff. Victor, true to his promise, worked alongside Clara and the team, offering help without overstepping. At one point, he even joined the kitchen staff to taste test hors d'oeuvres, earning playful applause from the cooks when he approved a recipe without a single critique. "Who are you, and what have you done with Victor St. Clair?" Clara teased as he returned to the ballroom. "Just a man trying to learn," Victor replied with a grin. On the night of the gala, the estate was transformed into a winter wonderland. Twinkling lights adorned every surface, and the scent of fresh pine and cinnamon filled the air. Guests began to arrive, their laughter and conversation creating a lively, festive atmosphere. Clara stood near the entrance, watching as Victor greeted each guest with a genuine warmth she hadn't seen before. He moved through the crowd with ease, stopping to share a laugh or a memory with old friends. "You've done an amazing job," Eleanor said, stepping beside Clara. "He may never admit it, but Victor couldn't have pulled this off without you." Clara smiled. "He's learning. Slowly, but he's learning. And thanks to you, he's enjoying himself," Eleanor added. "It's been a long time since I've seen him this present." Clara nodded, her gaze following Victor as he helped an elderly guest to her seat. "It's nice to see him like this," she said quietly. As the evening progressed, Victor made his way to Clara, who was organizing the final touches on the dessert table. "Clara," he said, his tone sincere, "thank you. Not just for coming back, but for pushing me to be better. This gala wouldn't have happened without you." Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You're welcome, Victor. But let's be honest, you did a lot of the work too. And it wasn't just about the gala." Victor smiled. "You're right. It wasn't. But I'm glad it brought us here. The day of the Christmas gala arrived, and Clara stood in the middle of the bustling ballroom, overseeing last-minute preparations. Every detail she had planned was coming together perfectly. The gold and ivory table settings sparkled under the chandelier's glow, the garlands were lush with fresh greenery, and the towering Christmas tree shimmered with handcrafted ornaments. She could see the guests arriving outside, their laughter floating through the air as they admired the estate's winter wonderland. Victor approached her, looking composed in a dark suit and tie, a stark contrast to his usual brisk, businesslike demeanor. There was a warmth in his expression that Clara was beginning to recognize more often. "Everything looks amazing," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Clara gave a small smile, surveying the room. "I think we pulled it off." "You did more than that," Victor replied. "And now it's time for you to enjoy the evening." She raised a brow. "Enjoy? Last I checked, I'm working." "Not tonight," Victor said, his tone firm but kind. "I've invited your family to the gala as my guests. They should be arriving any moment." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "My family? But, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," Victor interrupted gently. "Your father believed in me when I had nothing, and your family deserves to be part of this celebration. Not as employees. As honored guests." Clara opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his voice. After a beat, she nodded. "Thank you, Victor. It means a lot." When the doorbell rang, Clara was at the top of the staircase, watching as Victor personally greeted her family. Her mother, dressed in a modest but elegant coat, clutched her purse nervously. Clara's younger siblings, wide-eyed with awe, clung to her mother's sides as they took in the grandeur of the mansion. "Mrs. Dawson," Victor said warmly, extending a hand. "Welcome to the gala. We're honored to have you here." "Thank you, Mr. St. Clair," Clara's mother replied, her voice soft. "This is quite the home you have." Victor smiled. "Please, call me Victor. And tonight, this is your home too." The children giggled as he bent down to shake their hands, introducing himself with a playful seriousness that put them at ease. Clara's youngest brother, Luke, pointed at the massive Christmas tree in the corner of the ballroom. "Is that tree real?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "It is," Victor said with a nod. "But don't worry, it's not as heavy as it looks. Want to see the ornaments up close?" Luke nodded enthusiastically, and Victor led the family into the room, motioning for Eleanor to join them. Clara descended the staircase, catching her mother's eye. They shared a quiet smile before Clara joined them near the tree. Eleanor was already engaged in a conversation with her mother, her charm and kindness easing any lingering nerves. "Clara's been a lifesaver for us," Eleanor was saying. "I don't know how we would have managed this gala without her." Clara's mother glanced at her daughter, her eyes glistening. "She's always been resourceful. Her father used to say she could solve any problem if she put her mind to it." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Sounds like she takes after him." Clara felt a swell of gratitude as she listened to them. Eleanor's sincerity seemed to bridge the gap between their two very different worlds, creating a moment of shared understanding. Meanwhile, Victor had taken Luke and Clara's teenage sister, Emma, to the dessert table, where they marveled at the spread of treats. Luke's excitement was palpable as he pointed at a gingerbread house, his enthusiasm infectious. "Can we eat that?" he asked, his face lighting up. Victor chuckled. "Not that one, it's for display. But we have plenty of cookies you can try. How about I help you pick some out?" As the evening progressed, Victor introduced Clara's family to several of his high society guests, ensuring they felt welcomed and included. To Clara's surprise, her siblings seemed to adapt quickly, their natural curiosity charming even the most formal attendees. At one point, Clara caught her mother standing near the fireplace, staring at a framed photo of Charles Dawson and a younger Victor. "He kept this," her mother said softly when Clara approached. Clara nodded. "He told me it was to honor Dad's memory." Her mother smiled faintly. "It's nice to know he hasn't forgotten. Your father would have been proud of you tonight." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat and reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. As the Christmas gala continued to sparkle with warmth and celebration, Victor found himself pausing in the middle of the ballroom, taking in the scene around him. Guests mingled under twinkling lights, the air filled with laughter and the faint sound of carolers outside. The atmosphere was lively, yet it felt intimate, a blend of high society sophistication and the genuine, heartfelt energy that Clara had brought to every detail. For the first time in years, Victor didn't feel like an outsider at his own event. He didn't feel the weight of proving himself or maintaining an image. Instead, he felt present, surrounded by people who weren't just there to network but to share in something meaningful. Spotting Clara near the fireplace, talking animatedly with a small group of guests, Victor made his way over. Her presence had become a quiet anchor for the evening, drawing people together effortlessly. "Excuse me," Victor said, gently interrupting. "May I steal Clara for a moment?" Clara raised an eyebrow, but she followed him to a quieter corner of the room. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone curious but not wary. "Better than okay," Victor replied. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Clara, I've been thinking a lot about what this gala, and everything leading up to it, has taught me. You've been the driving force behind all of this. Not just the event, but the way it's brought people together. The way it's reminded me of what really matters." Clara tilted her head, a small smile forming. "Victor, are you about to get sentimental on me?" He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Maybe. What I'm trying to say is, I want you to stay. Not as an assistant, but as someone whose ideas, compassion, and drive have become an essential part of what I want this place to be." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Are you offering me a permanent position?" "I am," Victor said earnestly. "I want you to have the freedom to create, to lead, and to help shape the way we do things here. You've already shown me that I need more of your perspective in my life. So, what do you say?" Clara's heart swelled at his words, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. For a moment, she thought of her father, of the legacy he had left behind and how this moment felt like honoring it in the best way possible. "I say yes," she replied, her smile lighting up her face. Victor visibly relaxed, his grin widening. "Good. Because I don't know how I'd survive without you." As the evening wore on, Clara's siblings became the stars of an impromptu carol performance. Luke and Emma stood near the grand piano, their voices rising sweetly above the murmurs of the crowd. Clara's mother sat nearby, her hands clasped as she watched her children with pride. When they finished their final song, the room erupted into applause. Victor approached Luke, who looked both thrilled and slightly embarrassed by the attention. "That was impressive," Victor said, crouching slightly to meet Luke's eye level. "You've got a real talent." "Thanks," Luke said, beaming. "Do you sing?" Victor hesitated. "Not well." Luke grinned mischievously. "You should try. It's Christmas, you're supposed to do fun things." Clara, who had been watching the exchange, chimed in. "He has a point, Victor. What's Christmas without a little singing?" Victor sighed dramatically. All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. The children cheered as Victor joined them at the piano, his deep baritone blending hesitantly with their bright voices. The room laughed and clapped along, the usually stoic Victor St. Clair endearing himself further with every slightly off-key note. Later, the party shifted into a lively Christmas trivia game, led by Eleanor. Guests formed teams, their laughter filling the room as they debated obscure holiday facts and answered questions about festive traditions. Victor surprised everyone by joining Clara's family's team, his competitive streak quickly coming to light. Which country is credited with starting the tradition of Christmas trees? Eleanor asked, her tone playful but firm. Victor leaned in, his voice low but urgent. Germany. Trust me on this one. Luke squinted at him. Are you sure? Because I thought it was Norway. I'm sure, Victor said with mock gravitas. I've got this one. Clara smirked. All right, Germany it is. When Eleanor announced the correct answer, Victor grinned smugly. Told you. Luke rolled his eyes, but he couldn't hide his grin. Okay, fine. You're pretty smart, for a grown-up. The team ended up winning the trivia game, earning a round of cheers and teasing remarks from the other guests. Victor accepted the playful ribbing with good humor, his usual formality replaced by a genuine sense of camaraderie. As the night wound down, guests began to filter out, their goodbyes warm and heartfelt. Clara stood near the front door, thanking each person as they left. Victor joined her, their easy banter continuing as the crowd thinned. When the last guest was gone, Clara's family gathered near the fireplace for a final toast. Victor poured the sparkling cider, raising his glass as everyone settled into the cozy space. To family, Victor said, his voice steady and full of warmth. And to the people who remind us of what's truly important. Clara's mother raised her glass, her eyes misty. And to new beginnings. The glasses clinked, and for a moment, the room was filled with quiet contentment. By the end of the night, the Dawson family prepared to leave, their faces glowing with happiness. Thank you for everything, Clara's mother said to Victor as they stood by the door. You've made this a Christmas to remember. It was my pleasure, Victor replied sincerely. Your family deserved to be here tonight. As the family walked out into the snowy night, Clara lingered behind, her gaze meeting Victor's. You didn't have to go to all this trouble, she said. Victor shook his head. It wasn't trouble, Clara. It was what your family deserved, and what your father would have wanted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. Thank you, she said simply. Victor returned her smile. Good night, Clara. As the door closed behind her, Victor stood for a moment, watching the snow fall softly outside. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be,